Port Charles has seen tragedy before. Storms have torn through lives, secrets have destroyed families, and betrayals have reshaped the future of many beloved residents. But nothing could prepare the town for the devastating wave of loss that struck in such a short time. Within days, 4 funerals were held, leaving the entire community reeling in shock and sorrow. The halls of General Hospital, once filled with the sounds of recovery and hope, now echoed with grief. Doctors who were used to saving lives found themselves comforting families instead. Friends who once shared laughter gathered in black attire, holding each other through tears. The small city that had survived mob wars, kidnappings, and dangerous conspiracies now faced something even harder to endure: saying goodbye to people they loved. The first funeral set the heartbreaking tone for what would become one of the darkest weeks in Port Charles history. The church was already full long before the service began. People stood shoulder to shoulder, filling every pew and even lining the walls. Outside, more residents gathered quietly, unable to fit inside but unwilling to stay away. Carly Spencer stood near the front, her hands clasped tightly together as she stared at the casket. Her eyes were red from crying, but she held herself together with the strength she had built over years of heartbreak. Beside her stood Jason Morgan, silent and stoic, though the grief in his eyes was unmistakable. "This shouldn't have happened," Carly whispered. Jason nodded slowly. "No," he replied quietly. "It shouldn't have." The tragedy had come suddenly, leaving everyone stunned. Only days earlier, life had seemed normal. Plans were being made, families were moving forward, and hope was beginning to replace past struggles. But fate had other plans. As the priest began the ceremony, a wave of silence fell across the church. Every person in attendance felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just the loss of a life, it was the loss of a future. Memories were shared during the service. Friends spoke about laughter, kindness, and dreams that would now never be realized. Tears flowed freely, and yet, even as the community tried to process this first devastating goodbye, they had no idea it was only the beginning. 2 days later, the same church doors opened once again for another funeral. The atmosphere was heavier this time. It wasn't just grief that filled the air. It was disbelief. Port Charles had barely begun mourning the first loss when another tragedy struck, leaving residents struggling to understand how so much pain could happen at once. This time, the crowd was even larger. Sonny Corinthos stood at the back of the church, his expression unreadable. Though he had faced countless enemies and survived dangerous battles, even he looked shaken by the events unfolding around him. Nearby, Michael Corinthos sat beside Willow, holding her hand tightly. "I don't understand," Willow whispered through tears. "How could this happen again?" Michael shook his head. "I wish I knew." The second life lost had been someone deeply connected to many families in town, someone who had been there through countless milestones, celebrations, and struggles. As the eulogies began, stories of loyalty and courage filled the church. But beneath those stories was a growing fear. Something felt wrong. 2 tragedies in such a short time didn't seem like coincidence, and that fear would only grow stronger after what happened next. By the time the third funeral arrived, Port Charles had transformed into a city in mourning. Black ribbons appeared on doors across town. Businesses closed early. Conversations everywhere revolved around the same question: why? Inside General Hospital, the doctors struggled to maintain focus. They had treated victims, supported families, and now attended funeral after funeral. Elizabeth Baldwin stood near the chapel window, staring out silently. "This doesn't make sense," she said quietly. Nearby, Dr. Terry Randolph sighed. "No," Terry agreed. "It doesn't." The third loss had shaken the hospital staff particularly hard. This was someone they had worked beside, someone they trusted, someone they believed they would see again tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. At the funeral service, emotions finally began to shift. Grief was still present, but anger had begun to grow. Port Charles residents were no longer just mourning. They were demanding answers. Anna Devane, standing near the front, looked determined. "If someone is responsible for this," she told Dante Falconeri quietly, "we will find them." Dante nodded. "We have to." Because 3 deaths in such a short span of time was no longer simply tragedy. It was a mystery, and possibly a crime. The 4th funeral was the hardest. By this point, the emotional toll on the town was almost unbearable. Families had attended service after service, barely having time to process one loss before facing another. Even the strongest residents of Port Charles were beginning to break. Inside the church, the silence felt heavier than ever before. Brooklyn stood beside Chase, her hand trembling as she held his. "I can't believe we're here again," she whispered. Chase nodded slowly. "It feels unreal." The person they were saying goodbye to had touched nearly every life in the room. Someone whose presence had once brought comfort and stability. Now their absence left a painful void. As the ceremony began, many people couldn't hold back their tears. Even those who rarely showed emotion openly allowed themselves to grieve. Jason looked around the room, his expression dark with concern. 4 funerals, 4 lives lost, and still no clear explanation. After the final funeral ended, residents slowly stepped outside the church. The sky above Port Charles was gray and overcast, as if reflecting the mood of the entire community. Groups of friends gathered quietly, offering hugs and words of comfort. But beneath the sadness, another emotion continued to grow: determination. Anna Devane spoke with several members of the PCPD near the church steps. "We need to review everything," she said firmly. "Every detail." Dante nodded. "We already started." Because while some of the deaths appeared unrelated at first, new information was beginning to raise serious questions. Connections were emerging, small clues, coincidences that no longer felt like coincidence. And if someone truly was responsible for these tragedies, the people of Port Charles were not going to let them escape justice. Back at General Hospital, the emotional impact of the week's events continued to ripple through the halls. Patients and staff alike struggled to regain a sense of normalcy. Elizabeth checked on several patients before stepping into the quiet break room. But something in the town had changed. The recent tragedies had reminded everyone just how fragile life could be, and how quickly everything could be taken away. Still, Port Charles had always been a place defined by resilience. People leaned on each other. Families grew closer. Friends refused to let grief destroy the bonds they had built. Yet one truth remained clear. The story of these 4 funerals was far from over. Because if someone truly was responsible for the heartbreak that had swept through the town, justice would come. And when it did, Port Charles would never be the same again. She sat down heavily, exhaustion visible on her face. Moments later, Finn walked in. "Rough day?" he asked gently. Elizabeth gave a small, sad smile. "Rough week." Finn nodded. "I think the whole town feels it." The 4 funerals had reminded everyone of something deeply human, that life could change in an instant, and that even heroes sometimes couldn't stop tragedy. Later that evening, Carly finally allowed herself to break down. Inside her home, away from the eyes of friends and family, she sat on the couch staring at old photographs. Jason stood nearby, unsure what to say. "I keep thinking about the last conversation we had," Carly said quietly. Jason remained silent. "I wish I had said something different," she continued. Jason stepped forward. "You couldn't have known." Carly wiped tears from her face. "I know, but that doesn't make it easier." Jason understood that feeling better than anyone. Loss had shaped much of his life. But even he admitted to himself that this week had been unusually cruel. As investigators continued digging into the circumstances surrounding the 4 deaths, a troubling theory began to form. What if these losses weren't random? What if they were connected? Anna reviewed documents late into the night. "Something ties all of this together," she murmured. Nearby, Dante studied the same files. "If you're right," he said slowly, "then someone planned this." Anna looked up. "And if someone planned it, we're dealing with a very dangerous enemy." Days after the fourth funeral, Port Charles began the slow process of moving forward. Businesses reopened. Children returned to school. Doctors resumed full schedules at the hospital.